The Ugly Duckling is one of the most profoundly misunderstood stories ever told. We think we know it. We think it's a heartwarming tale about finding your inner beauty and learning to love yourself. But that is a complete and total misreading of its real purpose. The story has almost nothing to do with inner beauty. Instead, it is a meticulously crafted, coded autobiography of its creator, Hans Christian Andersen. A secret diary documenting a life of almost unbelievable rejection, loneliness, and deep psychological pain. What if the famous happy ending wasn't a triumphant transformation at all, but a desperate lie the author told himself just to survive? And what if the story's real secret isn't about becoming a swan, but about what that swan truly represents? Think back to the story you remember. It feels as warm and familiar as a childhood blanket. We all know the iconic moments. The strange, oversized egg sitting awkwardly among the others. The moment of hatching, revealing a chick that is too big, too gray, too ugly. We remember the immediate rejection, the relentless cruelty of the barnyard, a world of pecks, bites, and insults from ducks, chickens, even the farm girl who kicks him away. Then comes the escape, and with it, the long, lonely journey into the wild. We can almost feel the biting cold of that terrible winter as the duckling freezes into the ice, alone and on the very edge of death. We remember his despair, his belief that he is fundamentally flawed, worthless, an outcast who will never belong anywhere. And then the glorious release of spring. He sees them, a flock of majestic, graceful swans on the water. Convinced he is about to meet his end, he bows his head to them, only to see his own reflection for the first time. He is not a duck. He never was. He is one of them. He is a swan. The story ends in joyous acceptance, a beautiful transformation, and the comforting moral that our true worth will one day be recognized. It's a perfect fable, a simple story of transformation that has given hope to countless people who have felt like outsiders. It is also a beautiful and comforting illusion. Because the real story, the one buried just beneath the surface of the ink, is infinitely darker. It's a story not of triumph, but of tragedy. And we don't have to guess. We don't have to speculate. We know this because the author himself gave us the key to unlock the entire mystery. In his own journals, Hans Christian Andersen openly admitted that the fairy tale was, in his own words, a reflection of my own life. That single quote is our doorway, and it opens a path to a devastating secret hidden in the story's final moments. The truth that the duckling's happy ending is, in fact, the most tragic part of the entire tale. Our investigation begins now. To understand the story, we first have to understand the nest it came from. The duckling isn't just different. He is born into the wrong world. He is an anomaly from the moment he draws breath, an oversized egg in a duck's nest. For Hans Christian Andersen, this setup wasn't just a metaphor. You have to understand, it was his literal reality. He was born in 1805 in Odense, Denmark, into a world of almost unimaginable poverty. His father was a humble shoemaker who died when Hans was only a boy, and his mother was a nearly illiterate washerwoman who battled alcoholism. 19th century Denmark was a society with a brutally rigid class structure. You were born into your station and you died in it. There was no social mobility. There was no climbing the ladder. If you were born a peasant, you were a peasant for life. But Andersen, from his earliest days, felt a profound and agonizing disconnect. He was a highly sensitive, deeply imaginative, and fiercely ambitious soul, trapped in a world that had no place for him. He was obsessed with art, with literature, with the theater, passions that were seen as bizarre and utterly alien for a boy of his class. Like that oversized egg, he was an artistic soul, mistakenly dropped into a world of manual labor and poverty. But this social rejection was only the first layer of his torment. And as we'll soon see, the physical ugliness he endured would eventually force him to construct a psychological defense so powerful it would become his most famous story. In the story, the duckling's suffering is immediate and physical. He is pecked, bitten, and chased by every single creature he encounters. This relentless daily torment is a perfect mirror for the public and professional humiliation that Hans Christian Andersen endured for his entire life. The cruelty of the barnyard was the cruelty of the Danish literary world. First, there was his appearance. Andersen was painfully aware of how he looked. He was unusually tall and gangly, with enormous feet, a large nose, and a lanky frame that made him a constant target of ridicule. Contemporary accounts, even from those who admired him, often described him as gawky, awkward, and even ludicrously ugly. This constant social rejection, this feeling of physical monstrosity, was the first layer of pecking he had to endure. He was a walking target for mockery. But the far deeper pain came from the criticism of his work. Today, we see Andersen as a literary giant, but in his own time, especially in his home country, he was savaged by the critics. His writing style was a revolution. He wrote as people actually spoke, using simple, direct language that was accessible to everyone, not just the highly educated elite. The Danish literary establishment saw this as an unforgivable sin. And if digging for the real story is a sin, then consider subscribing your official confession. They attacked his grammar, called his stories childish and unsophisticated, and dismissed his work as vulgar. One critic famously wrote that Andersen didn't know how to write the Danish language. Imagine dedicating your entire life to your art, only to be told by the gatekeepers of your culture that you are a fraud, an amateur, a clumsy peasant pretending to be a writer. Every one of those cruel reviews, every condescending comment at a social gathering, every snide remark about his common style was another vicious peck. It wasn't just a critique of his writing, but a confirmation of his deepest fear, that no matter how hard he tried, he would always be the ugly, awkward boy from the slums. He was an outsider trying to break into a club that would never, ever accept him. So you see, the barnyard wasn't some fictional place. For him, it was Copenhagen. Can you even imagine pouring your entire soul into your work, only to be told you're a fraud? After being driven from his home, the duckling faces his darkest trial, the long, brutal winter. He is utterly alone, freezing, starving, and on the brink of death. This desperate, isolating winter is perhaps the most direct and heartbreaking metaphor in the entire story for Andersen's own emotional landscape. It represents his profound, chronic, and lifelong loneliness. Throughout his entire life, Hans Christian Andersen desperately craved love and companionship, but he never found it. He was a man of intense passions, but his affections were almost always unrequited. He fell deeply and obsessively in love with a number of people, both men and women, but each relationship ended in agonizing rejection. He wrote passionate letters to the Swedish opera singer Jenny Lind, whom he called his nightingale, but she saw him only as a brother and eventually married someone else. He developed an intense attachment to Harold Scharf, a handsome ballet dancer in Copenhagen, but that relationship too, whatever its nature, ultimately fell apart, leaving Andersen devastated. His personal diaries are filled with entries that are almost too painful to read. He writes of his fiery passions, his deep yearning for a physical and emotional connection, and the crushing despair of his solitude. He was famous. He was celebrated across Europe. But at his core, he was a deeply lonely man who went to his grave feeling unloved and unwanted. The duckling's journey through that freezing, desolate winter was so much more than a plot point. In truth, it was the emotional reality of Andersen's entire existence. It was a perfect symbol for a man frozen in a state of perpetual emotional isolation, forever looking for a warmth that would never come. And it's this deep, personal tragedy that sets the stage for the story's final revelation, forcing us to dig past the simple biography and into the much deeper soil of psychology and myth. We have now seen how perfectly the story maps onto Andersen's life. The rejection, the humiliation, the loneliness. It's a flawless autobiography. But if we stop there, we miss the entire point. We miss the real secret. To uncover the story's deepest layer, We have to move beyond simple biography and ask a much more profound question. Why a swan? What does the swan truly represent? But the answer has very little to do with beauty. The swan's symbolism is far more ancient and powerful than that. Across cultures and throughout mythology, the swan is a primordial archetype. It's a sacred symbol of purity, of divinity, and most importantly, of artistic genius and inspiration. In ancient Greek mythology, the swan was the sacred animal of Apollo, the god of music, prophecy, and poetry. The muses, the goddesses of artistic inspiration, were often depicted with swans. Even the soul of the great poet Orpheus was said to have been reincarnated as a swan. This connection is so deep that it has woven itself into our language. We speak of a great artist's final, beautiful creation as their swan song. When Hans Christian Andersen chose the swan, he was tapping into this incredibly deep well of mythological meaning. He was doing much more than just saying, "Look, I'm not ugly anymore." That's the surface reading, the children's version. In reality, he was making a far more audacious and, frankly, more arrogant claim. He was saying, "You people, you critics, you aristocrats who mocked me, you are mere barnyard animals. You are ducks and chickens concerned with earthly, trivial things. But I am not one of you. I am a swan. I am an artist. My soul is connected to the divine, and my work, my art, makes me immortal." It was an act of profound defiance. He was elevating himself, through his own story, into the timeless pantheon of the greats. And this brings us to the linchpin of the entire mystery, the clue that reframes everything we think we know about this supposedly happy story. The triumphant ending, the duckling's transformation into a swan, doesn't depict a real-world victory. Instead, it is one of the most brilliant and tragic examples of a psychological defense mechanism ever put to paper. It is an act of what psychologists call sublimation. Sublimation is the process of taking overwhelming, painful, or socially unacceptable emotions, like rage, despair, or crippling insecurity, and channeling them into a productive and socially valued outlet. For Andersen, his art was his act of sublimation. His life was a constant barrage of trauma. He was insecure about his class, his appearance, his education, his sexuality. In the real world, he was powerless to change these things. He couldn't make the critics love him. He couldn't make society accept him. He couldn't force the people he loved to love him back. He was trapped in his own skin, in his own life. But on the page, he was God. On the page, he could rewrite his own story. He could take all of that pain, all of that rejection, and transform it. He could turn his gawky, awkward self into a creature of divine grace. He could make the barnyard animals that tormented him look small and foolish. The story is the transformation. The act of writing it was the only way he could feel like a swan. It's a pattern we see in his work, and as I've detailed in my previous excavation of The Little Mermaid, he used this exact same psychological tool not just to cope with social rejection, but with a desperate fear for his own immortal soul, a story worth exploring when you're done here. And this is where the profound tragedy lies. The transformation was only ever real on paper. In reality, fame did not heal him. Success did not fix his wounds. Even after he became one of the most famous authors in the world, his personal diaries show the exact same man. Deeply insecure, terrified of criticism, desperately lonely, and convinced of his own fundamental ugliness, he would fly into a panic over a bad review. He would agonize over the smallest social slight. He died a rich, famous, and profoundly broken man. The happy ending never happened for him. It was a fantasy he created, a beautiful lie he told himself so that he could endure the truth of his own life. The story wasn't a reflection of his reality. It was his escape from it. Let's look closer at the story's most pivotal moment. The discovery. The duckling doesn't just wake up one day and realize he's a swan. The transformation isn't internal. It only happens when he sees himself in an external medium, his reflection in the water. He needs the mirror to show him who he is. For Andersen, his art was that mirror. It was the only place he could see a version of himself that he could stand to look at. Think about what that means. It suggests that his own sense of self-worth wasn't something he could generate from within. It was entirely dependent on what his creative output reflected back at him. As long as he was writing, as long as he was creating these beautiful tales, he could look into the water of his own work and see the reflection of a swan. He could see a genius, a divinely inspired artist, a being of grace and importance. But what happened when he wasn't writing? What was left when the mirror was gone? All that was left was the duckling. All that was left was the gawky, insecure, lonely man from Odense. This reveals an incredibly fragile psychology. His entire identity, his entire sense of value was tied up in his work. This is why the criticism was so devastating to him. A bad review was never just an opinion on his story. For him, it was a crack in the mirror. It was the world telling him that his reflection was a lie, that he was, and always would be, just an ugly duckling. The story's climax was never about self-acceptance. Instead, it was about the desperate need for external validation, a need that art could fulfill in a way that life never could. And that desperate need for validation drove him to entertain one final, extraordinary fantasy, one that connects his personal pain to a universal human wound. There is one final piece to this puzzle, a strange, persistent rumor that followed Andersen throughout his life, a rumor that he himself may have quietly encouraged. The rumor was that he was not the son of a poor shoemaker at all, but was secretly the illegitimate son of Danish royalty, perhaps even of the king himself. There is no real historical evidence to support this, yet the idea persisted. Why? Because it perfectly aligns with the story's deepest psychological engine. This desire wasn't just about social climbing, but it was about rectifying a cosmic mistake. The fantasy of being a secret prince is another version of the duckling story. It's the idea that you weren't born into the wrong class by accident. You are secretly noble, and you have been unjustly cast out from your rightful home. It's a desperate attempt to explain away the pain of not belonging. And this is where Andersen's personal tragedy connects to a universal human wound, a primordial fear that resides in all of us. The fear of illegitimacy. Not in the literal sense, but in the existential sense. The feeling that we are a fraud, an imposter, a changeling left in the wrong nest. The profound human ache to find our tribe, to be accepted, to finally come home. The Ugly Duckling endures not just because it was Andersen's autobiography, but because it is, in some small way, all of our autobiographies. It gives voice to the part of us that has felt outcast, misunderstood, and alone. Andersen's genius was in taking the unique, specific agony of his own life and transforming it into a story that touches the universal core of our shared human experience. He never found his flock of swans in the real world, so he created one for all of us on the page. Andersen masterfully used a children's story to hide the tragedy of his own life. But some stories go beyond hiding a personal tragedy. They're hiding a real-life plague. The dark history of Ring Around the Rosie is far more sinister than you were ever taught in school. And the terrifying truth is buried right under our feet. Click here to join the excavation.